I never had much of a family. My mom passed away after her own family cut her off, and my dad was in and out of mental hospitals before he ended his life. The only relative I knew about was my dad's brother. One of the few dark secrets I knew about my family was that my uncle blamed himself for my dad's death. Because of that, he isolated himself in a cabin deep in the Maine woods and lived there in seclusion. I only had a rough idea where the cabin was and had no desire to contact him, so to me, he was as good as gone, just like my parents. The truth is, I blamed him for my dad's death, too. Focusing my anger on him was the only thing that brought me some peace after a terrible childhood. By the summer of 2015, against all odds, I had built a life for myself in the Boston area. I worked as an assistant manager at a brewery pub, lived in a small but cozy apartment, and even went on a few dates. I was well on my way to leaving my old life behind, and that felt better than I could ever describe. Then, a letter arrived that changed everything. It came from a lawyer's office in Augusta, Maine. As soon as I saw the postmark, I had a feeling about what was inside. Sure enough, it was a letter informing me that my uncle had passed away, and that the lawyer was tasked with dividing my uncle's estate among his surviving relatives. I always assumed my uncle wasn't wealthy, and I was right, but that didn't mean I wasn't entitled to something in his will. Unfortunately, I had to travel to Augusta to find out what it was. I called the lawyer's office, pretended I was too busy to make the trip, and asked outright what I had inherited. To my surprise, the lawyer said he didn't know. All he had was a key to a safety deposit box in an Augusta bank, and his job was to ensure I opened the box and understood the significance of its contents. His only motivation, his payment was locked inside the box, too. It sounded like the plot of a bad movie, and it took the lawyer assuring me he was serious before I started to believe it. Part of me wanted nothing to do with it. I knew digging into the past would only reopen old wounds I'd worked so hard to heal. But the lure of potential money was too strong to ignore. So one Friday in mid-July, either the 17th or 19th, I took a half-day off work and began the 5.5-hour drive to Augusta, Maine. The drive was pretty nice, considering it was summer, but as I got closer to the law firm's cozy, welcoming office, I felt a growing sense of dread. I imagined the worst, that I would receive a letter revealing some horrible truth about my family that would undo all the progress I had made. So, you can imagine how anxious I was when I met with the lawyer and went to the bank with him to unlock the deposit box. By the time the bank manager showed us to the room where the boxes were kept, I was sweating with nerves. When I opened the box and saw nothing but a wad of cash and a single letter, I thought my worst fears were coming true. The lawyer took the money, but when it came to reading the letter, I hesitated. It got to the point where the lawyer asked if I was actually going to read it or if I wanted some time alone. I asked him to do something unusual. I wanted him to read the letter for me and summarize it as coldly and clinically as possible. I knew I wouldn't be able to read it myself for a long time, but I needed to know what it said. As much as I hated my uncle, he was family, and I felt it was the right thing to do to honor his final message. I watched the lawyer's face as he unsealed the envelope, took out the letter, and began reading. A look of confusion crossed his face as he scanned the contents. He must have sensed my impatience because he showed me the letter. It wasn't a lengthy apology or explanation. It wasn't a goodbye or a dying wish. All it contained was a set of numbers I assumed were coordinates and 3 scribbled words. Burn it all. When the lawyer asked me what the coordinates meant, I had no idea. But a quick Google search revealed they pointed to a random spot in the Debsconiag Lakes wilderness. I wasn't sure, but I was pretty confident it was the location of my uncle's cabin. What he wanted me to burn, though, was a mystery. In a matter of minutes, I went from wanting nothing to do with this grim situation to being consumed with morbid curiosity. My imagination ran wild, and I started to theorize about the dangerous or immoral things my uncle might have been involved in. I had to know more because if he'd left behind something terrible, I wanted to destroy it. The ride back to the lawyer's office gave me a chance to politely question him about my uncle's death. I figured if my uncle had died at home, someone must have seen inside his cabin. But according to the lawyer, my uncle drove himself to the hospital about a week before he died and had made arrangements for the deposit box months before. So, as far as the lawyer knew, my uncle was the only person who had ever seen the inside of that cabin. Before I left the lawyer's office, I asked for his advice, and I'll never forget what he said. Well, as my grandpa used to say, sometimes things bury you if you don't bury them first. And he was right. I couldn't lose any more sleep over this. It had nearly destroyed me once before, and I wasn't about to let that happen again. It was clear what needed to be done. I would drive out to that cabin, do my uncle one last favor, and burn whatever horrible truth it contained. I planned to check into a nearby hotel and head out at first light the next morning. But getting 8 hours of sleep turned out to be too ambitious. When the motel clock ticked over to 2 a.m., I figured I'd better use my time to study Google Maps for the best route to the cabin. By the time the first light of dawn began to break, I was packed and ready to go. I didn't think I'd need much, just a gas can and a box of matches, both easily acquired. Once I had an extra-large coffee in my cup holder, I was ready for the 3-hour drive to the lakes. The entire drive, those 3 words echoed in my mind: burn it all. I've never been so consumed with curiosity in my life. It was like holding my breath for too long. I just needed to let it all out. I had to know how my uncle had lived for the past 30 years and what he wanted me to burn. But exploring that cabin could risk my sanity when I could just burn it down and walk away. I tried to make up my mind, but I didn't know what I would do until I stood face to face with the old, rotting cabin and the truth it held. When I was almost certain I was within walking distance of the coordinates, I parked my car in an old lot near a trailhead and headed northwest toward what I assumed was the cabin. About half an hour into my hike, I noticed something strange about the plants in the area. Eventually, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A pile of what looked like raw meat and a brain lying in the dirt. At first glance, I thought it was some kind of animal remains. The texture and color were almost identical to flesh, but I soon realized it was actually a fungus. I later found out it was called Gyrometra esculenta, or more commonly, brain fungus. It's highly poisonous, but not uncommon in northeastern forests. However, what was unusual was how frequently I saw the distinct-looking fungus in the woods. And that wasn't the only strange mushroom I found. The next type I encountered was even creepier. While the brain fungus was just gross, I mistook the devil's tooth mushrooms for pieces of bloody human tissue. If you look them up, you'll see what I mean. Young specimens ooze a bright red substance that I later discovered contains anticoagulant properties. In plain terms, it looks like blood and can make you bleed more easily. Creepy, right? But the strangest thing was how many of these mushrooms were scattered around the forest. They were everywhere, sometimes 2 or 3 at the base of every tree. And the closer I got to the coordinates, the more there were. I had a GPS app on my phone to help me keep track of where I was, and I didn't have to worry about losing cell service because it worked offline. But as it turned out, I didn't need any fancy equipment to find the cabin. All I had to do was follow the mushrooms. I smelled the cabin before I saw it. It was an overpowering stench, like stewed meat, but with a rotten undertone. By the time I saw the filthy wooden walls through the trees, I nearly gagged from the smell. The cabin was covered in brain fungus and devil's tooth mushrooms, growing where the wood met the soil or where moisture clung under the windowsills. I can't stress how utterly exhausted I was by this point. It was almost noon on a hot, humid day, and I'd been hiking with about 2 gallons of gasoline in my backpack, which was no easy feat. I just wanted to get this over with and head back to my car. But as I pulled out the gas can, a thought struck me. I had no idea what was causing the smell. Was it from some kind of flammable gas? Maybe that's what my uncle meant when he said to burn it all. If the fumes were indeed flammable, tossing a match might. In July of 1977, the affluent Thompson family from Northville, Michigan, embarked on a vacation at their summer cottage along the shores of Lake Huron, just south of Mackinaw City. The couple, John and Linda, had built their wealth in the publishing and advertising industries and had nurtured 4 beloved children throughout their nearly 2 decades of marriage. Their children included 20-year-old Jonathan, 17-year-old Greg, 13-year-old Robert, and 8-year-old Anna. To those acquainted with them, the Thompsons epitomized a successful, happy, modern family. However, lurking beneath the surface were numerous dark secrets, some far more sinister than others. John's new art magazine was beginning to face challenges, and his overall financial situation was deteriorating. Bills from the company went unpaid, bank accounts displayed erratic activity, and investors increasingly doubted John Thompson's ability to deliver returns on their investments. Compounding the problem, there had been an alarmingly high turnover rate among John's secretaries over the past 10 years, with many leaving before completing a full year of employment. This was due to the unsettling and predatory environment John fostered in his workplace, where he was notorious for his disturbing habit of asking female employees to raise their skirts so he could touch their legs. However, John's wife was oblivious to all this, and as the family set off for their summer retreat, which they called Lakeview, a quaint log cabin nestled along a winding road just off Lakeshore Drive, she had no inkling of the horror that awaited them. About a month after the Thompsons first arrived at Lakeview, the caretaker in charge of maintaining the summer homes began receiving several complaints about a foul odor emanating from the Lakeview property. When the caretaker arrived, he found all the doors and windows securely locked and assumed that the Thompsons had perhaps left some food out or that a sewage pipe had burst. Wanting to ensure the safety and preservation of the property, the caretaker carefully forced his way into the house without causing much damage. Once inside, he was confronted with a scene so gruesome that it haunted him for the rest of his life. One of the first things the caretaker noticed, besides the overwhelming stench of decay, was the oppressive heat inside the cabin. The Michigan summer had been relentless, and even without central heating, the heat was almost unbearable. Yet here was the Lakeview cabin, in late July with its heat turned on full blast. Then he saw the body of Linda Thompson, her corpse bloated and decomposing rapidly due to the heat. She was lying face down, covered with a checkered blanket from the waist up, with a congealed pool of blood seeping from a single gunshot wound to the head, inflicted by a .25 caliber pistol. John Thompson was found dead on top of a heating vent, shot with both the same .25 caliber gun that killed his wife and a .22 caliber rifle. He had also sustained severe blunt force trauma to his head, leaving his skull cracked open, revealing the grisly contents within. Overcome with horror, the caretaker fled the house and immediately vomited before rushing to contact local authorities. When the police arrived, they discovered young Robert lying on top of his deceased father. The 13-year-old had been executed with a single shot to the head, similar to his mother, and was partially covered by a blanket. 8-year-old Anna Thompson's body was found just a few feet away from her father and brother. She had been shot multiple times and also had a severe skull fracture, likely caused by a hammer-like object. The 2 older Thompson children were found in a bedroom, each shot multiple times in the head with the .25 caliber pistol. 17-year-old Greg had been shot twice in the head and also in the back, as though he had been trying to flee from the assailant. A ballistics expert was brought in to reconstruct the sequence of events based on the positions of the bodies and the bullet trajectories. The expert concluded that someone had approached the cabin from a distance, watching until they had a clear shot at John Thompson through one of the windows. Once the initial shots were fired, the killers moved in to finish the job. They forced their way into the house through the back door and chased the surviving family members, shooting them one by one. After slaughtering the Thompson family, the killers pulled the curtains shut to conceal the bloody scene inside, turned up the heat, and covered the broken window with cardboard. The fact that only one set of bloody footprints was found at the crime scene suggested that the murders were carried out by a single assailant, someone who meticulously covered their tracks so well that the crime went unnoticed for an entire month, leaving the bodies in a state of advanced decomposition that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact time of death. The evidence pointed to a well-planned, carefully executed attack by someone experienced, possibly even a seasoned killer. The last people to see the Thompson family alive were a couple of tree trimmers who had been hired by John to clear the area around the cabin. Neighbors recalled hearing loud noises and shouting in late June, but assumed the gunshots were from hunters in the vicinity and failed to report them. Given John's troubled financial situation, investigators focused on the possibility of a disgruntled business partner or a dissatisfied client. This led them to question a man named Joseph Calero, a 31-year-old former soldier who had been working for Thompson's advertising agency since the mid-60s. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered several glaring inconsistencies in Calero's statements, and further investigation revealed that he had been embezzling significant amounts of money from the company. Although this embezzlement was not directly linked to the murders, it made Calero a person of interest, and he soon became the focal point of the investigation. It was discovered that Joseph had recently visited a local firearms dealer where he purchased 2 Beretta pistols and an AR-7 rifle. The police cross-checked the calibers of these weapons and made a chilling discovery. The pistols were .25 caliber, and the rifle was a .22, exactly the same calibers as those used to kill the Thompson family. During their investigation, police also learned that Calero's father-in-law owned a local shooting range. Acting on a hunch, they searched the facility thoroughly and found spent AR-7 shell casings identical to those found at the Lakeview house. Although Calero claimed he had given the weapon away, a neighbor reported seeing the .22 caliber AR-7 rifle in Calero's home shortly before the Thompson murders. During subsequent interrogations, Calero failed 2 polygraph tests, and the third was deemed inconclusive. It was also noted that he attempted to deceive the polygraph examiners during pretest interviews. Despite this, an Emmett County prosecutor initially decided not to press charges, citing the missing murder weapons and the absence of Calero's fingerprints at the crime scene. However, for years later, in 1973, a newly elected chief prosecutor in Oakland County reopened the case, believing he could secure a conviction against the prime suspect. But on March 9, 1974, when Calero learned of the impending charges and arrest, he took his own life with the same pistol believed to be the murder weapon. Joseph left behind a blood-stained typewritten note in which he confessed to being a liar, a cheat, and a fraud, and included a list of people he had defrauded in various business schemes. He also added a handwritten note to his mother on the same sheet of paper, stating, "I had nothing to do with the Thompsons. I'm a liar, but not a killer. I'm sick and scared. God and everyone, please forgive me." Since Michigan law does not allow an open murder case to be officially closed, Calero's suicide placed the case in an inactive file. As a result, many of the unanswered questions surrounding the Thompson murders remain. Over the years, both amateur and professional investigators have proposed various theories to explain the motive or identify a suspect, but none have ever been substantiated. Those who knew John Thompson personally were adamant that they had never known a better family man, friend, or business associate, and could not fathom why anyone would murder him or his family in such a brutal, merciless manner. Furthermore, many have cast doubt on Joseph Calero's supposed guilt, suggesting that he was nothing more than a small-time crook whose financial misdeeds ensnared him in a larger web of deceit and murder. Nevertheless, the official stance remains that the person responsible for the Thompson family murders has never been identified, and as time passes, it becomes increasingly unlikely that they ever will be. Thus, it is possible that the perpetrator of these heinous crimes went to their grave having killed fleeing children and evaded justice entirely. Herbert Mullen, born on April 17, 1947, in Salinas, California, was the only son of a World War II veteran. His father, who had served in the war, was a stern and disciplined figure, often recounting his wartime experiences to instill a sense of loyalty and discipline in Herbert. Despite the strict upbringing, Herbert grew up as a well-adjusted young man, popular among his peers and voted most likely to succeed in high school. However, in 1965, just after graduating, Herbert's life took a tragic turn when one of his closest friends died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The sudden loss deeply affected Herbert, leading him into a depression from which he would never fully recover. Within weeks of his friend's death, Herbert had created a small shrine in his room, which included a yearbook photo, a few possessions of his friend, and some lit candles. When his girlfriend discovered the shrine, she was disturbed, suspecting that Herbert's grief had taken a darker turn. Herbert confided in his girlfriend that he feared he might be in love with his late friend, which only deepened the rift between them. In an attempt to cope, Herbert turned to marijuana and LSD, hoping the drugs might bring him peace, but this only worsened his mental state. By 1969, at the age of 21, Herbert's family suggested that he voluntarily admit himself to a psychiatric facility for treatment. Though he agreed, Herbert's stay was brief, and he soon began to exhibit signs of paranoid schizophrenia. His behavior became increasingly erratic, leading to an eviction from his apartment after he was caught shouting at imaginary people. Homeless and struggling, Herbert even tried to join the priesthood, but was rejected due to his deteriorating mental health. In 1972, Herbert was arrested for vagrancy after a police officer found him burning himself with a cigarette. His parents took him back into their home, where for a short time his behavior improved. But this respite was brief, as Herbert began to develop a delusional belief that human sacrifices were needed to prevent devastating earthquakes. Herbert became obsessed with the fact that his birthday, April 17th, coincided with the anniversary of the Great San Francisco earthquake of 1906, a disaster that had killed thousands and leveled much of the city. He convinced himself that he was destined to prevent similar catastrophes by offering human lives to some ancient force beneath the earth. In his twisted mind, Herbert saw a connection between major California earthquakes and periods of peace between American wars. He believed that wars provided enough bloodshed to satisfy this subterranean force, but during times of peace, earthquakes would strike to claim more lives. This belief set Herbert on a murderous path. Herbert's first step was to apply to join the U.S. Marine Corps, following in his father's footsteps. He passed the mental and physical tests but was ultimately rejected due to his history of drug use. This rejection fueled his paranoia, leading him to believe that there was a conspiracy against him, orchestrated by powerful figures and even his old high school friend, Jim John Era. Herbert blamed Jim for introducing him to marijuana, which he saw as part of a larger plot to ruin his life. Herbert tracked down Jim, who had moved to a new home in Santa Cruz. Posing as a friendly visitor, Herbert gained entry to the house and then killed both Jim and his wife before mutilating their bodies. He then returned to the home of Kathy Francis, who had unknowingly given him Jim's address, and murdered her and her 2 young sons. Herbert's killing spree didn't end there. He brutally beat a homeless man to death, believing him to be a reincarnation of a biblical figure. He also murdered a 24-year-old college student who was hitchhiking and mutilated her body. Despite the horrific nature of his crimes, Herbert appeared to show remorse when he visited a church and confessed to a priest, only to then kill the priest, believing him to be a willing sacrifice. Herbert continued his killing spree, even shooting a retired fisherman in broad daylight, but it was his final murder that led to his arrest. Pulled over by police, Herbert was found with a rifle in his car and was arrested without resistance. While in custody, Herbert confessed to his crimes, claiming that his actions were necessary to prevent earthquakes. During his trial, Herbert's sanity was called into question. His detailed confessions and the calculated nature of some of his murders suggested he was aware of his actions, but his history of mental illness provided a compelling defense. In the end, Herbert was found guilty of first-degree murder for some of his crimes and second-degree murder for others, resulting in a life sentence. Though Herbert remains in prison, His delusions about preventing earthquakes have persisted. Interestingly, in the 11 days following his arrest, a significant earthquake struck Southern California, causing considerable damage. This eerie coincidence only reinforced Herbert's belief that his actions had been justified. Herbert Mullen's story is a chilling reminder of the dangers of untreated mental illness and the devastating impact it can have on both the individual and those around them. Whether Herbert was simply a disturbed individual or someone who believed he was fulfilling a dark prophecy, his actions left a trail of death and destruction that continues to haunt those who remember his name. In the summer of 1979, Susan Sharp and her 5 children moved from their home in Connecticut to Northern California, escaping the violent temper of her abusive husband, James. They settled into a modest cabin in the quiet Sierra Nevada town of Keddie, and it seemed the Sharps had finally found a place they could truly call home, a place where they felt safe instead of constantly fearful. Then, on the morning of April 11, 1981, Susan, her 14-year-old daughter, Sheila, and her 5-year-old son, Greg, were returning from a friend's house. They stopped by the local baseball field to pick up 10-year-old Ricky and happened upon 15-year-old Johnny, who was hitchhiking home with a friend named Danny. After lunch, Sheila made plans to spend the night at the neighboring Seabolt family's home, while Susan stayed at the cabin with Ricky, Greg, and the boy's young friend, Justin. Sheila left for the Seabolts around 8 p.m., leaving her mother and the kids behind. 12-year-old Tina had joined her older sister for a brief visit, but returned home to sleep at around 9:30 p.m. Little did anyone know, this would be the last time the Sharp family would be together, as a horrifying and preventable tragedy was about to strike. The following morning, April 12th, Sheila returned home from her sleepover to find a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The lifeless bodies of her mother, older brother, and his friend lay on the living room floor. All 3 had been bound with electrical tape, and Susan appeared to have been gagged with a blue bandana. The attackers had acted with extreme brutality. 2 bloodied knives and a hammer were found at the scene, with one of the knives bent at a sharp angle from the force used. Blood evidence indicated that the murders had taken place in the living room, but the killer had taken the time to arrange the bodies into a gruesome display. Susan was found lying on her side near the living room sofa, partially undressed. She had been stabbed in the chest, and her throat had been slashed so deeply that it cut through her larynx and nicked her spine. An imprint matching the butt of a Daisy BB gun was found on the side of her head, evidence that she had been struck to subdue her. Johnny and Danny both had their skulls crushed with a hammer, but while Johnny had a deep cut on his throat, bruising around Danny's neck suggested that he had been strangled instead of bled out. Sheila then went upstairs to find that the younger children, Ricky, Greg, and Justin, were safe in their bedroom, but Tina was missing. Neither Sheila nor the Seabolt family heard anything unusual during the night, but a couple living in a nearby house reported hearing muffled screams around 1:15 a.m. Along with Tina's disappearance, her jacket, shoes, and a toolbox containing various tools were missing from the cabin. There were no signs of forced entry, and the cabin's phone had been left off the hook with the drapes closed, leading police to suspect that the victims knew their killer, who had tried to hide the crime before leaving. Immediate suspects included a man who vanished from Keddie shortly after the murders and was later found in Oregon. However, after passing a polygraph test, he was cleared of suspicion. One of the Sharps' neighbors, Marilyn Smart, later claimed she had found a bloody jacket belonging to Tina in her basement and had turned it over to the police. Her husband also reported that a claw hammer had recently been stolen from his home, which made him a person of interest, though he was eventually ruled out as well. Young Justin Smart gave conflicting accounts of the night's events, including a claim that he had dreamed the details of the murders. Later, under hypnosis, he recounted hearing strange noises coming from the living room while he was asleep in the bedroom with Ricky and Greg. Investigating the sounds, he saw Susan with 2 men, one with a mustache and short hair, the other clean-shaven with long hair. Johnny and Danny then entered the room and began arguing with the men before Tina was taken out of the cabin, never to be seen again. Over 4,000 hours were spent investigating the case, with some officers describing the process as frustrating and fruitless. Rumors that the crime was related to a ritual or drug trafficking were dismissed, as no drugs or paraphernalia were found in the home. A family friend later told detectives that Danny had recently stolen some LSD from local drug dealers, but there was no proof to support this claim. The police were so baffled by the murders that they even theorized that serial killers Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole might be responsible, though this was ruled out by December 1983. Tina's disappearance initially prompted an FBI kidnapping investigation, but after determining that the Department of Justice was handling the case adequately, the FBI stepped back. Local officers, with the help of search dogs, scoured a 5-mile radius around the cabin but found nothing. Then, on April 22, 1984, more than 3 years after the murders, a bottle collector discovered part of a human skull and a jawbone near Feather Falls in neighboring Butte County, over 100 miles from Keddie. After announcing the discovery, the Butte County Sheriff's Office received an anonymous tip stating that the remains belonged to Tina, but for some unknown reason, the call was not recorded in the case file. Forensic experts later confirmed that the remains were Tina's, and detectives also found a blue jacket, a blanket, a pair of jeans, and an empty surgical tape dispenser near the bones. The case remained unsolved for many years until a 2008 documentary about the murders featured Marilyn Smart, who claimed she suspected her husband Martin and his friend Bo Bobetti were responsible for the murders of Susan, Johnny, Danny, and Tina. Marilyn stated that on the night of the murders, she awoke around 2 a.m. to find the two men burning something in the wood stove. She also mentioned that Martin had a deep dislike for Johnny Sharp. However, in the same documentary, the local sheriff insisted that Martin had passed a polygraph test and was not considered a suspect. Bo Bobetti, who was reportedly connected to the Chicago mob, had died in the late 1980s, leaving the case cold. It seemed the mystery of the Keddie murders might never be solved, but in March 2016, a hammer matching the description of the one Martin claimed to have lost was found in a nearby pond. The Plumas County Sheriff stated that the location where it was found indicated it had been deliberately placed there, not accidentally dropped. He also mentioned that he had a list of 6 potential suspects, including Martin Smart, Marilyn's husband, and Justin's father. Marilyn continued to argue that Martin was guilty, revealing that shortly after the murders, he had left Keddie and gone to Reno, Nevada. From there, he sent her a letter discussing their marital issues, ending with the chilling words, "I paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." A counselor whom Martin regularly saw also alleged that Martin had confessed to killing Susan and Tina, but claimed he had nothing to do with the boys. He allegedly told the counselor that Tina had been murdered to prevent her from identifying him, as she had witnessed the entire crime. In April 2018, police announced that DNA evidence recovered from a piece of tape at the crime scene matched that of a known living suspect. It appears the mystery of the Keddie murders may soon be solved, though the truth behind these brutal killings could be even darker than anyone imagined.